Hello, and welcome to the Wolf Den podcast. Once again, Zenitsu and I are your hosts. I'm Naco, and you all know Zenitsu. Um, so today we're going to talk about some rather controversial topics, some like bigger picture ideas. Um, the idea of a sideboard and/or mulligan in Digimon. As we all know, it was announced in the DigiFest, or I guess for those that weren't aware, the DigiFest in-person events will include a 10-card side deck to be used in between games 1 and 2 and 3 in a best of series, and a mulligan. It's a fairly simple mulligan, I guess, as far as card games are concerned. It just includes that you lay out your 5 security, you draw your starting 5 hand, and if you don't like your starting 5 cards, you can then bot deck all 5, drawing 5 more. I guess, why don't you just give me your initial thoughts on that, Zenitsu?
So I am totally okay with the way sideboarding and Mulligan goes. As far as what they laid out, the one important thing that we actually have to keep in mind is this is not 100% official yet. Like I've seen on the internet a lot of people talking and hyping it up and clickbaiting like it is. This is just a test. So we need to keep our expectations whelmed because it might not actually make it into the official game. But I think a 10 card sideboard is probably the proper amount of cards. It might seem like it's a little bit too much for some or too few for others, depending on the kind of game you come from. But I think like deck ratio to sideboard it is in that sweet spot. And then as far as the mulligans go, it is a very simple yet effective mulligan that tries to at least reduce the amount of non games because if you just draw a hand of like nothing but level fives and sixes, now you have the opportunity to try to actually get a new hand and get some rookies to actually try to tempo out. But it does have its own risk reward system in place with that, where now you know you're going to be having a couple of level fives and sixes on the bottom of your deck. How will you respond? So it's definitely a really interesting, simple, yet effective way at trying to change the game in a meaningful way. Because we also have a lot of these cards that are kind of like already designed for a sideboard that we have to include in our main board. So there's a lot of pros and cons to having a sideboard and not having a sideboard and how the mulligan works and everything. So I think it's going to be a really interesting change to see what actually happens in the end.
So, I guess to really like start from the bottom, um, if anyone has ever spoken to me, they'd know that I've always been a big fan of sideboards and mulligans in card games, specifically competitive card games. Um, but not even necessarily exclusively competitive card games, because I know a lot of people's idea behind against a sideboard and a mulligan is that um, it'll tend too much towards the top. But I think like the inclusion of a mulligan, and if not like a free mulligan, as this kind of is, it isn't, and we'll get into that later, but um, it is a free mulligan, is fairly like friendly. You know, the idea that you could just instead of like losing a game that you just lose by your opening hand, by the luck of the cards exclusively, you could lose. You can just opt to either A, quit the game, or B, mulligan. You know, like without a mulligan, those are games where, and I've played them before. I'm pretty sure we all have, where you just kind of lose on turn zero, turn one, whichever, whatever you want to call it. Like, I mean, I know my classic example of this was back in Lord Nightmon meta. I was playing Lord Nightmon. Don't hate me. Who cares? And having the 6 cost on play level fours, um, as your basically cheapest play was a death sentence because while they were only level fours, you were only really kind of missing a rookie. The idea that you had to just slam a level four that cost 6, giving your opponent 6 memory on their first turn that's enough to give them a Lord Nightmon. One for or 3 is free, one for 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. I guess they pass the turn, giving, but they have a Lord Nightmon in raising for your turn 2, and you have a level 4 on board with 1 memory. congratulations, you've lost the game. So,
Y- Yeah, it's a little bit brutal when you get into those situations, and like it's not only just with level fours, it's level fives and sixes where sometimes you just don't see a rookie to really start the game if that's the type of deck that you're playing. Granted, I do think Digimon's design is really interesting on, well, you still can play cards, so there's at least that versus other games where it's like in Magic, you open up a hand with no lands, you already lost the game. So like it's really interesting on how Digimon just allows you to try to play your cards, but it still does have those non-games.
yeah, like the technicality of the play, I guess here is obviously the counterpoint, but like I said, like by you playing that level 4, you've already kind of lost. You could make it slightly better, kind of, if you just hard play the level 5, assuming you have it, though you run fewer of them usually, etc. Um and but I guess going back to the beginning, um I do like a sideboard and I do like a mulligan. And the idea behind the mulligan for me again is just that you it introduces a skill element, and it's something I know I'll probably mention 100 times over the course of this podcast. But um, every time you introduce an element of choice or decision to be made, like besides like basic gameplay functions, right? Like I choose what to digivolve into. I choose whether to like I have two rookies and no fives. So I could just go 3-4 pass turn. I could go 3-3. Usually that second level 3 was preferably maybe like a searcher, and now I'm like searching through my deck looking for something. Um, those are all choices to be made within the realm of the game, but as we introduce outside choices, I think you're still introducing these elements of skill. And in a game with a mulligan, especially a free mulligan as this one is, I think the better player will just win that small percentage more of the time.
Right. And like just going back to the whole choice topic, like between sideboards and whether you mulligan, that is just more choice that you have to think about when evaluating any given moment in a game. It's just like you need to look at your opening hand and be like, oh, these are five level fives and sixes. You know there's going to be less of those in your deck, but you know they're important. So something like a Jesmon, where it's just like you see your savior and you see a Jesmon, and you have to mulligan because you don't see a rookie or any way to efficiently play your cards, it's like now you know those are going to be on the bottom of your deck. So now you know there's going to be less of a chance that you're going to see another Jesmon because you don't know if one's going to be in your security and you don't know where in your deck the others are going to appear.
I know I've seen a lot of people who are opposed to mulligans specifically mention Justmon, and I have some math to go over as a result of that. But um, again, really looking at the specific nature of the Digimon proposed, or at least not proposed, like the current iteration of the mulligan, as we're just going to refer to it. It's not like obviously if it moves beyond Digifest in some fashion, it may change. Um, it may never move past Digifest. Um, because I know in the first inkling of sideboards and mulligans was all the way back in, I believe it was BT4, the BT4 survey that Bandai puts out. And as someone whose degree focused a lot on survey building, survey making like questions fair and equitable, and like companies care a lot about the questions that are put in surveys because they don't want to they put as few in that are relevant so that you'll still answer them all and they can get as many people to answer these surveys as possible because they really want this data to drive their product and their market. And one of the questions involved like two separate questions stood out to me. One being the idea of like there's a question involving do you want a mulligan? Do you want a sideboard? And the other one being asking indirectly if you want a sideboard or a mulligan, which was just asking what is your least favorite situation that you are put in the Digimon card game, with some of the options being I draw a hand with no rookies. I draw a hand of like no Digimon, stuff like that. And I think those are the kinds of things that this mulligan serves to remove. are the option or the hands where you just don't get to play the game.
Right, and that's kind of the like point of any mulligan is just to reduce the amount of non-games because like there are plenty of games with different resource systems and different things that are going on with it in itself that just allow the game to just not exist because you don't have the cards to actually adequately play the game.
I know you already mentioned it, but I do think it is like a major point of like pro mulligan is that um the mulligan does come with a choice. It is free on paper. In People have argued that it's too forgiving of for the ability to just pitch your starting hand to the bottom of your deck. But those 5 cards are theoretically gone. You know, for all intents and purposes, they are gone because the searchers at most search top 5 as far as we've seen. Um, and you like in a reasonable sense won't hit those cards ever, even if you keep searching off the top of your deck and keep tucking cards to the bottom, because the bottom is just it's that far away. These decks are 50 cards, counting the full security and whatnot, but um,
And even with 10 cards gone for security in hand, like that's still a lot of cards to go through. Like I've played very I'm like a filthy aggro blue player. So obviously I try to end games as quickly as I possibly can. But like when games get drawn out is the only time you'll ever hit the bottom of your deck, and that's the only time it'll matter is like against those really long drawn out control type matches. And usually if you're an aggro player and you're at that point, or like any normal player and you're at that point, there's a very high chance that you're going to lose just because of deck out because you're unable to kill them.
yeah, that's a good point. But um, so those cards are like theoretically gone, and you really have to think, I guess, to really understand the basis of why I want a mulligan, if I understand, like, what is a hand I don't want to see? And it usually isn't a hand that includes a level 6. Honestly, like, or it includes all level 6s, but then are you really, like, pitching a hand with 4 level 6s and a level 7 if you only run 6 level 6s in your deck? Like, because those, like, I guess my point being is that those games aren't like, oh, a free reroll for the player that mulligans, right? Like, those are games that would have been for, you know, outside the most extreme circumstances, auto loses, where like the mulligan doesn't just fix that situation. You just draw 5 cards now knowing you've pitched your entire top end to the bottom.
Right, and I really do like the way that is because it is a risk reward to the mulligans, which mulligans should have a risk reward. Bringing back the whole magic example, like every time you mulligan, you lose a card, but you have a better chance at trying to fix your hand to make it a non-game. So that is the risk reward. I think that like some games do an actual free mulligan where you have to shuffle your deck. The only problem with that is that takes time. That's why a lot of the like diggers dig and they don't actually search, is because it's easier and faster to flip cards off the top of your deck rather than look at your entire deck, search for the specific card that you need, and then shuffle it all back in. That's a very time consuming process. So I kind of like the whole idea where you're just putting it to the bottom and that's it, because it is very quick, very snappy, and it has its own sets of pros and cons.
Yeah, I think that's a running theme here with um like the proposed rules because they follow like standard like tournament flow and they minimally impede upon like the set line of play that we already have. So like I had heard people prior. I've had, you know, if not shouting matches with people. They could never add a mulligan. What would you do with security? Well, they literally answered that for us already. So, yeah, thank you, people. But that I think that's smart of them. I'm not saying that we should touch security. I also don't think we should shuffle our deck because it's all stuff that takes time. And the more impactful a mulligan is, the more people are going to be opposed to it, and the more people that are going to not want to include it because for any other reason other than it wastes time. It makes tournament rounds last longer than the proposed, 50 minutes from start to finish, 5 minutes of extra time, 5 to 10 minutes of, calculating results. These tournaments already take a while. We don't need, you know, what 65, 70-minute rounds as at a standard, now to account for shuffling of decks in between rounds and whatnot.
Yeah, because sideboarding's already going to take up some time. And even though, like, yes, you do get effectively free information to stack your deck backwards, like, most games aren't going to run that long where it's actually going to matter. Like, I think, like, I've only, out of all my 1 year, I guess, has it been a year? It has been a year. Out of all of the 1.5 or however long Digimon came out, um, of me playing competitively, I've only gone to the bottom of my deck a total of one time against one security control player. So it's not like stacking my deck backwards actually was like something that really mattered. It actually kind of did in that security control matchup, but that aside, that's a more specific problem to security control in and of itself rather than the free information to stack your deck backwards. Because I remember people talking about that all the way back in like what BT or I was going to say BT1 1.5 where there was like a green deck that actually tried to reverse stack your deck and it wasn't necessarily a super viable thing because games just didn't last that long where it mattered.
Yeah, just like the idea that like I will say like I very rarely, if ever, even take a second look at cards that I pitch to the bottom because they're gone. Like they're you're not going to see them again. There aren't decks that run enough searchers. Like, and I again have to preface that like this conversation with like the context of the game. There are people that are going to say like, well, what if Digimon introduces true tutors? Okay, that's a little different. We don't have tutors. We have searchers. Reveal top five, top three, top four. Throw them to
I
trash.
call
Throw them to
them
your
diggers.
hand.
I
Yeah,
call them diggers just because like tutors and searchers is like something completely different. Like your digging is another magic term. Just like I use the word or terminology looting, where it's like that's the act of drawing and
yeah.
discarding all in the same action. Like these are magic terms, but I think they still are kind of relevant because that's essentially what you're doing. You are digging through your deck to find the specific card. And yeah, like if that coincides with mulligans on like trying to reverse stack your deck, that's actually really cool. That adds an even extra element of skill because now you have to think about, oh, what would I need to see? When would I see it come that late of a game? So like it just all coincides and meshes with each other to make such a really interesting experience.
So, um, I guess I can't really think of any other time to best since we're really just focusing on the mulligan right now. Um, and I know people have talked about Jesmon as like, oh, what happens if we get a mulligan? Jesmon will run rampant. Well, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that at all. I have some math to kind of support that, but before that, like, would that even really be so terrible if Jesmon was allowed to play the game again? Because I know as much as everyone has lost to, that like immediate OTK always sees their pieces Jesmon, it wasn't even in the top 32 in North America. So as far as like deck lists publicly provided, there is no Jesmon. Um, the actual example deck I have from which I've based my calculations on is the third place Latin American deck because it's the only Jesmon I found. So it's
At least
here.
one that top nationals,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah. In reference to nationals, again being like the highest level of competition, because why wouldn't we use data exclusively from the highest level of competition? I'm sorry if there's a guy at your locals that constantly wins with Jetsmon. I don't know, run for Ice Wall. Wait, you can't. Um, but so there's a website. We could probably just throw it in the description. If anyone actually wants to check it out from the Magic days or my Magic days, um, it's a website that basically calculates exact odds of combinations. So, what is your deck? How many of each card are there? How many do you need to see? And in how many cards? And it'll give you an odds. So it's just a multivariate hypogeometric distribution. And it sounds really fancy. It just spits out percentages and you just put in names and whatever. But I have here the third place Latin American national finals, um, Jesmon deck, and I guess to start this, we have to think about like what is the Jesmon OTK. So I've defined the Jesmon OTK as, so you need a Jesmon stack, kind of a very specific Jesmon stack. The rookie does not matter. So any rookie, step one. Then a starter deck Greymon security attack +1, a Savior Huckmon, a Jesmon. Supporting pieces required for said OTK are then any Sistermon, any one Sistermon for the activation of the Jesmon effect. Not even, I guess, required necessarily, but just to pretty much guarantee it survives security at that point. Delicate Plan, I know is included in the decks, not necessarily required for the OTK, so I've left it out. But, and then any combination of either starter deck, tie, or Blitz Omni to swing for additional swings. Um, so that being said, that specific lineup, including the rest of it, so you want to see those cards, one of each, and nothing else. Or at least you don't need to see anything else. Not that you don't care. Um, I found through just throwing some hands together that the fastest a Jesmon could reasonably expect to OTK is turn 4, assuming that your opponent is not just handing you 7 memory a turn. So as long as you've
Right.
received 3 or fewer memory, or I guess 2 or fewer memory, um, with the idea being at one of those turns, you have to play the Tamer. So in this
And
situation, okay, go ahead.
yeah, and that seems to sound really, really fast, but like turns in Digimon go relatively quickly, especially in the early game, just because there's a lot less of decision making that actually needs to be made.
Yeah. So and honestly, like if you want me to just bullet out real quick, so if you're trying to line up what I'm trying to say in your head, that means you start the game, your turn 1, 3 4, pass, 2 memory. They pass you any amount less than 3. You go to 5, pass turn. They pass you any amount less than 3. Again, now you have a savior in raising. They're not going to pass you 3 memory. They know what's going to happen. You've seen every one of your pieces so far. You play your tamer, passing any amount of memory. It doesn't matter. I guess 3 at that point would be the max. They pass you. Who cares? At least 3. You now raise Jesmon, ties on the field, or you raise Savior, Evo into Jesmon 4/3, then swing, slam a sister, 3 checks, restand, 3 checks. Blitz Omni for game. So um, that's a true OTK, and running it through this deck, this calculator can be used for many other things. It was basically exclusively used for, if anyone cares for the history of it, um, basically decks that can be greedier, decks that run their resources in their decks, magic decks. Um, if you need to play a creature of XX mana cost on X turn, what does your mana base have to be? And that's what this was really created for. I've adapted it to Digimon. Other disclaimer here, since I'm really just trying to make the math as transparent as possible, there is no way to account for security in this calculation. The only way would be to run and compare permutations in which any combination of your combo pieces was missing. So if I change the number of Jesmon available in the card pool, the number of Sistermons, Saviors, all of this changes. But since we all do
That's
start with 50 cards, it's as close as we can get.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that like security is also an enigma that could also be beneficial at times. So it's just like, okay, you don't have the tie, but they hit the tie and it pops out a security. Well, now your combo is online. So like it is not perfect math, but it's good enough for just hand data to support the idea of a mulligan.
So again, all that being said, let's the actual numbers here. The fastest, that you could reasonably expect to win for a Jesmon turn 4. By turn 4, playing your Tamer doesn't net you a draw. You can't count the draw of the actual Blitz Omni, so you would be then seeing 12 cards. You're starting 5 and an additional. 7 more. Um, so out of the top 12 cards, one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are combo pieces, and the actual percentage odds of that happening is 11.6% of the time. So that's the actual like statistical likelihood of a true Jesmon OTK. Not
Right, and
not counting security.
and yeah, and the way this mulligan works doesn't necessarily make that any easier or harder. It's just, hey, only 11% of the time Jesmon will see the God Hand or the God Stack, and sometimes it'll even come a little bit later in the game. So like maybe they just need to dig a little bit harder. That does happen. Um, and then the obviously that'll play with the percentages and it'll slightly increase over time. But again, the more time you're giving the opponent, the more time they have to actually be able to respond and stop you. So take that as you will.
So the real point of this though being that the way the mulligan works. Um, so by tucking, bot decking your top 5 cards, the only decks or the only hands, I guess, you would really wish to tuck in these situations are decks that include none or 3 or fewer combo pieces, I guess. But I mean, I guess if you're seeing, it depends on those 3 though, because we all know how Digimon works differently. Because like I would say that I might even still keep a hand, including like a starter deck Greymon, a Sistermon, and a Tamer Tai. That seems like a fairly fair hand. I don't know what those other 2 cards are, but like again, only a rookie, and this is also accounting. So I guess this is moving like because we haven't really talked about it yet. People do use the searchers against it, and I think while we still don't have true tutors, the searchers um, still allow for mulligans to exist because while the
Right, because it's not
searchers
harming it.
do make the game more consistent, they don't take away from the mulligan, and it's a singular one-time mulligan too. I'm sorry, continue.
Oh, yeah, and it's not like there's a whole bunch of other things that go into it, like how we play the game, because a lot of people coming from Jesmon, like they don't even digivolve on top of their egg into a Huckmon. They just hard play it 100% of the time just because they need that search. They want that dig, and sometimes they value that more than the card draw. So like just the difference in playstyle also could shift some of that percentages to be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And then, like I said before, the reverse stacking of your deck, that also could be a factor in long games. So it's not like this is actually going to make Jesmon any more consistent. It's just going to make it so Jesmon can try to play the game a little bit better.
Now, I mean, it is also worth to note that this is the BT6 version of Jesmon. The BT7 version of Jesmon, I think, is a little better. Um,
We're labeling it as BT6 because like classic really doesn't change anything at all.
yeah,
Like people could say it like for the vast majority of decks, they don't even use a single classic collection
Gabuban's
card.
the only
And
thing that has a recognizable difference between A and B.
Lilith Loop 2, just because Analog Youth, like anything that could take advantage of like Analog Youth win rate 60%, or just a very like the majority of the decks are very minuscule in terms of changes. But that aside, like um it's not like the mulligan is actually hurting anything. Like that's kind of the whole point of it, where it's just like some people are against it, but like it's realistically not hurting anything. You don't even have to do it if you don't want to. It's just again reducing the amount of non-games just because you have that option. And like I said, it does have its own set of risks and rewards, and that's what a mulligan should be.
So, and something I was just thinking about when because I have the cards in my hand right now. I've been playing with them when I've been trying to figure out like these, like as quick as possible Jesmon games. Um, that's you win, you get the perfect Jesmon stack 11.6% of the time, assuming you play perfectly. Because something I didn't think about is when you mentioned the playing in my ideal perfect Jesmon hand, you have 3, 4, 5, 6 Tamer, And so what this is calculating is just you see those pieces in top 12. So if you open, you know, 3, 4, 5 Tamer and then an extra card, one of the few spare cards out of the top 12, do you really Evo off of that? Like, you need to search for your Jespawn. You don't know where the Jespawn is. You don't know that it's only 3 cards into your deck. So you don't Digivolve. You hard play it. And now you need to find another rookie that isn't searchable. I guess Huckmon can search for Huckmon, but um, you need to find another rookie to then start the trade again, because this isn't accounting for that.
Right, and like there are certain pieces that you would prioritize higher than others just because of how Digimon decks are built compared to other decks in like most other card games. So as an example, if I see a tie and a savior, I would probably keep that because I know those resources are a lot more scarce than some of the others in the deck. Like, yeah, okay, there's only four starter deck Greymon, but like as long as you have that tie, you're able to chip, you could still deal like for security in a single turn with that tie and Huckmon on top of a or Savior with the Jesmon stack. So like there's parts and pieces that like are interchangeable depending on how the game flow goes. And again, that's just making things a little bit more interesting.
Yeah. And this also, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier. This is also isn't including the multitude of actual win cons JustBot has. Um, I know that they can win. They don't have to win with Blitz Omni. They can win with a Goonie. They can win with, other just priorly hard played Digimon, either a Huckmon or maybe a Sistermon, just played for a draw one. Like more passive turns, more passive plays, less like win the game in exactly 4 turns plays, but like I guess the ratio of like it does kind of have a more finite like window of like aggression.
Right, and we're only bringing up Jesmon because as of right now, Jesmon probably is the greediest deck we have.
Yeah. Um, Less important to me only because it's a lot harder to permituate, but I do have a Lilith loop, a BT or EX1 Lilith loop. Um, Prior to, I guess, yeah, EX1 assumes prior to MDF banning anyway, but their ratios and like the likelihood of them seeing their pieces, but I don't really want to get into it as much because the lines of play are less consistent. Um, and the ability of the deck to filter itself by looting, um, and just the multitude of plays it does, where like playing Analog Youth to um, it's a tempo based play because they need the White Tamer out for MDF slash win for 60% anyway, while also looting and looking for future combo pieces, while also filling their trash for that combo. It's a lot harder to really quantify.
Yeah, it just goes to show that Digimon is a completely different beast of a game, and these rule changes are going to have a impact on how we're going to play the game as a whole, for the good or for the bad, depending on how things are actually said and done.
So yeah, um, I would say in the same amount of time, a Jesmon would see 12 cards. Um, Rough, just based on my experience with Lilith Loop exclusively, um, they would probably see, between 16 to 20 cards. And at that high end, that would mean that they have a 19.3% in their first 20 to see their combo pieces, their necessary combo pieces, which is higher, but it's also a much better deck. So,
Agreed. But going on to the more bigger topic that seems to be on a lot of people's minds with sideboards. Just because Mulligans is a little bit more of a simpler thing, there's not that much going on with it, but there's still, like, again, that decision making, and sideboarding is definitely one of the more important and more decision making heavy aspects of the rule change. And it definitely has its own pros and cons just because again Digimon is a completely different game than everything else. So things are going to be not exactly the way we think they're going to be when we're actually getting into the nitty-gritty.
yeah. Um, it is definitely something I feel like more people have been opposed to. In from my experiences, like from either reading online or just having discussions with people at locals, most people when they refer to mulligans just kind of say Jesmon bad and then kind of move on.
Yeah.
Or
Oh,
security control bad because security control's hands are so much more fluid that they can like even have like an iffy hand and they're like, I might as well just try again and maybe get a better hand.
although the funny thing is, I was looking at two different surveys. One I ran myself, and then another I just found online. And actually, a lot more people are in favor. Like the initial wave of people are the negative people. Those are the ones that are going to be speaking out the most. But the vast majority of players are actually in favor of mulligans and sideboards. Granted, more people want the mulligans than the sideboards, but there is just more people that want to have those two rules added into the game than not.
Yeah.
And then there are those percentages of people that just don't care. They just want to play Digimon because it's a fun game.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess to go over both again, like the the amount of people that don't want to see any changes for any combination of reasons, um I guess like I feel like are people that aren't as concerned with the competitive environment. Like while a lot of the conversations I've seen about sideboarding, like less mulligans, more sideboarding, has been in regards to the competitive environment. Um, it's usually been from a place of not understanding exactly the competitive environment or understanding the competitiveness of a sideboard and the purpose of a sideboard. Um, and I was gonna go somewhere with that, but um, just that I guess as we mentioned before, the idea of they each time you introduce a decision, you're introducing a correct or incorrect choice to be made. You know, a skill element, and if you consider a sideboard 10 separate choices to be made prior to the game starting, and then 10 separate choices to be made in between each sideboarding session between games 1 and 2. You know, that's plenty more opportunities for the better player to start to edge out their opponent in winning.
Right. And like Digimon kind of, I don't want to say they made sideboarding a little bit easier than some of the other games. Like silver bullets exist in card games. Digimon's not the first to do it. But Digimon has a little bit of an easier time making that decision, but like Digimon's always done that. Just with the whole idea of evolution lines in each set, they want you to play, oh, Jess or Huckmon into Bauhuck into Savior into Jess. They want you to play that way. Is that going to happen all the time? No, but like Digimon already implemented sideboard based cards for you to already think about utilizing in your main. And granted, keep in mind these cards were designed way before this rule was even came up with. They were already thinking about these types of things as development continued.
Yeah, I guess to an extent, I guess before we go over more specific stuff, we have been sideboarding somewhat already, but we've just had to do it. Like I guess that's my initial argument is for people who are against sideboarding is you already have been, just you haven't been noticing it because the idea that you mainboard 2 or 3 memory blockers because of how good they are. You mainboard, you know, copies of uh, Takumi Aiba from BT5, or Emergency Program Halt, or um, geez, I'm trying to think of, like just generically like splashable sideboarding. These tech options that we've referred to in past, those
Mechanorimon
those are
has
all so like Mechamorimon's almost a different animal, but these are all like just tech options. Tech cards in general is the essence of a sideboard. Now, Mechanorimon I feel like is potentially the the wrong not the wrongest, but the worst end that Digimon has as of now kind of, um, where it is color agnostically splashable, which I guess the rookies are too, but only if you discount the idea that um, you're not cutting other rookies for those rookies because in the decks that do made board them now, I guess besides Dan Vang's Agubond, they are on colored tech cards.
I mean, some of other decks, depending on what the deck is, they've done like weirder stuff where it's just like, well, not really weirder stuff, but like somewhat offbeat while being on beat at the same time. Like I've seen, again, going back to Aguban, running Magnadramon. Uh, that's a yellow card in a red deck, and they're not running any other cards to support it. They just care about the fact that it says recover too. Nothing else about that card matters. So like we've already been doing this in between events just to prepare for the difference in the metas going into the event, where it's like, oh, previously Gabuband was doing well. Well, now everyone is playing security control and teching in Ancient Troymon to handle that matchup. So it's like you're already subtly doing this. You just don't really realize that the sideboard is just a more prominent way of doing this.
I mean, like again, as someone who plays or played like Royal Knight slash blockers for all of BT6 Classic, um, my whole deck was a sideboard essentially. My whole deck was a tech-based meta call. If I wasn't playing up against Musketeers or Setcon or some of the matchups I've specifically designed my decks to beat, like I'm significantly like I basically call my deck the tier 1.5 deck that only loses to tier 2 decks or tier 3 decks, you know?
No, I 100% understand that sentiment because like I think I've said that in a couple of my videos where it's just like, yeah, this deck. Oh no, it was in some of my discussions when I was discussing the difference in BT6 between Ancient Bond and just normal Rookie Rush Bond. And it's just like, cool, Ancient Bond beats everything above it in terms of tier wise, but it has a harder time against everything that's below it, where Rookie Rush Bond was the reverse. It has a harder time beating things that are above it, but beats everything below it. And that's like another perfect example where it's just like, what do you side in and why are you siding it in? Most of the time, you want to try to side in things for your worst matchups, which are usually going to be decks that are stronger than yours
Yeah.
or just as strong as yours.
So it
And you don't want to side in things that are like, oh, I'm already winning this matchup, might as well win more by siding in this card. Like, that's generally a bad use of a sideboard.
I think what sideboards would really allow Digimon to do, if you know implemented, um, would just allow decks to play more color thematic or archetype thematic cards and having less to worry about those tech choices that we've mentioned. You know, black blockers, black Royal Knights, I would much rather prefer in a completely um, neutral environment to be running four of the uh, Toy Agumon that gives additional DP to rookies or blockers, or the even like the Toy Agumon that gives the you draw one when your opponent doesn't attack on their turn. All cards that would actually support the archetype and really lead into the philosophy behind a black blockers deck. What do you want to do? How do you gain advantages? But those cards are all worse than a Chumon in the matchups where Chumon matters. But they're also Chumon is worse than those other cards in matchups where Chumon doesn't matter, which is why like memory blockers period are like a sideboard card we've already been maining.
Right. And like this goes back to like Japanese versus English game design. Like Japanese wants games to be fast, snappy, quick and over with, and that's why they also play best of ones to support that type of like gameplay style. Everywhere else tends to not want to do that, and they want like a more fair and balanced experience where there's actual gameplay and interaction, and like they want a more concrete experience rather than just a flash in the pan.
Yeah,
And sideboarding allows us to actually have more of that concrete experience because we get to try to help our deck flow and function. And it does change a little bit on how deck building goes because depending on what deck you are running, your sideboard can be drastically different. Like your sideboard could be a completely different sub package where you could try to fake out the opponent. Like there's just lots of depth that sideboarding adds as a whole. My stance on sideboarding as of right now I'm completely neutral on it. Like if we have it, cool. If we don't, oh well. But I do think that in guild-based games and best of three games, sideboarding is a more beneficial tool for a lot more skill to be expressed.
Yeah. I'm still 100% on board with sideboarding, 100% on board with mulligans. Um, but um, I was gonna say about um, sideboarding, the idea that you could take a deck and with a sideboard completely change it is actually one of like I have a small my actually um, just my locals has implemented the DigiFest rules by unanimous vote, um, only because we have a small-ish locals anyway now, or at least a small consistent group, and it just it's more fun for us to include sideboards and to include mulligans to let have less of those games where you're either not allowed to play because of your tech choices or you're not allowed to play because of your starting hand.
Right. And I think Bandai ran a survey a while ago on different formats, and they labeled sideboarding and mulligans as a more casual thing, which I think is kind of funny because it's actually a more competitive thing. But that aside, like it just shows that Bandai was still thinking about sideboards and mulligans, and that thought has never really gone away. And obviously now, with the culmination of the DigiFest rules, we'll see what the next evolution of that thought is, whether this experiment of theirs works and everything is like running fantastic, or if it's a complete dumpster fire and people are abusing things that they shouldn't have because, we're card players, that's just what we do. Look at security control as the biggest example of that.
I wouldn't go as far like because I was gonna mention earlier I'd forgotten, but um, I think that is it's there's already I guess major argument from my side of like why I think we should have sideboards and mulligans is we already play differently in Japan and Bandai already understands that we play differently than Japan. That's why we've had best of three since day one. At least as far as like competitive tournaments have gone, like online events and major store events, because we aren't Japan. We are less of that like bubblegum pop, like play your favorites kinds of card gamers, where like just the idea of it. I mean, I know Japanese had plenty of data on it, but like they want you to run Bauhackmon. They don't want you to necessarily run Starter Deck Greymon, even though it's significantly better. So, but like that's more of like the way that the
Well,
game was designed.
that's just the designers trying to make the job of deck building and card analytics a little bit easier for you. That's a somewhat completely different topic. I have an actual degree in game design, so like I worked on a card game. I was behind the scenes on basically the entire process. I know how card games are made. So that's something completely a little bit separate. But yeah, like obviously we do things that the designers don't necessarily think of, and the designers are only human and they can only think of so many different things because they're a small team versus like tens upon thousands of people, not necessarily hive minding, but like somebody out of that will find something completely broken and abuse the system. And that's going to be same for sideboarding as well, where it's just like, oh, we didn't actually intend this card to be used this way, let alone in a sideboard, let alone the way they're actually going to be playing it. So, like, I think Avenged Kidmon is kind of, it's not really in that territory, but it's definitely one that's kind of like, this card is obviously better than what it seems, just because the way it's supposed to be played is obviously against Three Musketeers as like a hate card. But that's more the thematic reason on why the card exists. The way the card actually is going to be played is to side in more options and to have a more option heavy package, or if your deck is running more options, or to hose on the opponent's options. Like that's how the deck is actually, or not deck, card is actually going to be used. And I think that's an unintended purpose that they might not have thought of.
Yeah. Um, I guess what I was gonna say in regards to like just differences between us and Japan though is that like Japan is more willing to play like easier like straight line Digimon in their decks than we are. We are more I don't want to say creative because like but we the way we want to play the game, the way Americans and English players wish to play the game is with that more competitive mindset, with that more aiming to win, at the risk of like having fun, I guess, especially in regards to security control, and like we will take things that shouldn't work and make them work.
Right. We're definitely a lot more stubborn, and we definitely want to try to break the game a little bit more. Granted, Japan as a whole, their usual design philosophy, which isn't just expressed through Digimon, it's expressed through literally all of their card games, is they love big, flashy, exciting moments. They love those huge combo turns. Like that's kind of why Yu-Gi-Oh is the way it is because like they just love that type of thing where games end super fast because you did something super cool. And Americans are just like, no, 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 no. We want to try to play this a little bit more fairly, and if something's broken, we'll call you on that BS. And then they'll exploit it until something is done about it. That's how generally English players will play the game versus Japanese based on Japanese design.
Yeah. We definitely do have like that idea of like hive mind and um net decking, and like there were a lot of people really excited for Jesmon into BT6, and like how it was supposedly the new Lord Nightmon, the new Tier 0, while I would argue that we never really have had a Tier 0 in um North America, or at least it's the only one I can speak of. But
No, I don't think we've had a
like
tier
like
zero
I feel
either.
like people that have that talk about Tier 0 haven't played a game where there is a Tier 0. Like
Yeah,
where like I mean, at least my definition. I know there are other definitions that people use of a tier 0 is like a deck that exclusively loses to like itself. Like
yeah,
the
it's
the
like
only
almost
time
pseudo
yeah,
It's like almost pseudo unbeatable, has such a high percentage across the board that like realistically the only way to beat it is to play it.
yeah,
That is like almost tier zero. Magic's definition of tier zero is basically anything with like a 60 to 65% win rate. That's when they start banning cards to, fix the problem to actually not have a tier zero deck. But I digress. And like going back to sideboarding and net decking and the whole hive mind thing, like we are a very humans are a very sociable creature, and like somebody finds some secret tech and then it gets spread across in a heartbeat. All they need to do is see it once, and then everyone will start copying it. That's just a very common thing that happens. And sideboarding is going to be one of those interesting like areas where it's just like, yeah, you could just have some staple sideboard cards, but like is sideboarding actually going to be something that is easily copyable? And I don't necessarily think it is, just because of how Digimon generally plays and all of the different other options that decks can have. In a lot of my videos, you could take basically the section at the end where I talk about all of these other cards, and that could almost be a sideboard type video in of itself, where it's just like, oh, how do I replace Pulsemon, the promo? Well, if you don't have Lotmon in your deck, here's Lotmon. It's drawing you a card. They're fulfilling a very similar role, and sometimes that's what you're looking for, or sometimes you're just looking for the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where it's just like you need that role to be different in a very particular way just to try to counter something.
yeah. Um, a lot of a lot of people's reservations with sideboarding, I think, does have to do with that like net decking, hive mind kind of thing, where like because we already have metas where they're not exactly solved, but like we definitely know what's better with the advent of having some amount of Japanese data. Like with the restrictions coming into place with BT7, that'll be less true, and it's we've already found that I guess with BT6 it was already unreliable, considering they were really afraid of Jespawn more so than we were. Um, but I also think that we just have the benefit of being able to find we have more time to play with what they like discover. I know you'd mentioned like Tommy, how Tommy didn't see play as much earlier BT7 in Japan, and then only did they start to up the numbers on it later, just realizing how much of a one piece, two piece, including the hybrid um, that Tommy turns into as like a two piece stun lock combo, and how it. So now I imagine, I guess we'll start off where Japan ended almost. Not exactly, but to an extent.
Yeah, that's kind of how we've always been. And the fact that, like, also Japan might not even have these rules. So a lot of Japanese data is going to be even less reliable because they don't have mulligans and they don't have sideboards because they could still be playing best of ones. We don't know if Japan is going to implement these rules also, and if Japan is actually going to be playing best of threes. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I think this is going to be an exclusive, like, English format thing to really diversify the different formats. And then a lot of that Japanese data does start to become more and more useless. Like, yeah, you could basically pick up the pieces where they left off, but you also have to accommodate the changes that we have versus they have. And some players just might not have that skill set to do that.
Yeah. Um, like I don't think they ever go sideboard mulligans. I really don't. I also don't think maybe mulligans. I guess I feel like they could live in a world with a mulligan without a side deck. Um, but I don't think they ever live in a world with both because I also don't think they even adapt to best of three. Really, like it's just they are happy where they are, and I'm happy for them. But I don't think they need to necessarily adapt to us essentially because just like we don't need to adapt to them.
Right, because I know not all Japanese format is best of one. I know, like, I think Singapore and Malaysia, even though, like, Singapore does want to play English format, just because Singapore is Singapore, and there's more English speaking than Japanese speaking. But Singapore aside, some Japanese format is best of three, but it's in very select countries. And again, Japan is very Japan focused. They only care about their Japanese bubble, and anything outside of that, they don't necessarily care about. So, like, seeing them implement these types of rules for English exclusive seems to be more of an English call than a high, like, a major Japanese board exec call. Like, it's something where the English branch just wanted this because we've been asking for it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. The I guess my last piece, at least on like the Japanese portion of it, is just that I think Japan and like I guess the restriction list even like because everything that we've had has come from them so far um has like the balancing of the game, the design of the game has basically catered around the idea of a Japanese local game store. That's like the pinnacle of game design, the pinnacle of competition um, for Bandai, at least in regards to the Japanese market.
Right, because, like, I think the restrictions on, like, the pandemic have been lifting in Japan, but the fact that they don't have, like, these 200, 300, 500 people tournaments online or in person is a little bit telling on just the difference on what Japanese want to do and what they want to play. And I think sideboards definitely is not part of that equation.
Yeah, sideboards and mulligans are definitely like large, competitive in like English focused, I guess. But so I mean, I guess dialing back a little bit, I know we touched on it. The idea of a sideboard, a lot of arguments I've seen is that it'll because of the hive mind, because of the groupthink, because of the way that we orchestrate things in North America, having given the Japanese data that we take and expand upon it, um, or we make it our own in some way, um, it'll make the meta even more restrictive and even more oppressing, and I don't really see that.
Like, I can understand the argument. Like, it's two sides of the same coin where it's just like there's always going to be good with something, like with this type of decision, and there's going to be bad. Like, yes, you could, as of right now, build a homogeneous Swiss Army knife sideboard to handle various different decks depending on what you're playing and how you're playing it. Like, security control, as an example, like, if the red package wasn't working, they could switch to a black one. If the black package wasn't working, they could switch to a purple one. Like, that's just as a quick example. You could even completely change how your deck functions with those 10 cards, depending on what you're trying to gain out of your use of the sideboard, where you could fake the opponent out. Oh, you think I'm playing security control? Haha, I'm actually playing Three Musketeers. Or you think I'm playing security control? Psych, I'm actually playing security aggro now. Like, there's just a lot of, like, 10 cards is a still decently sized portion of the deck to really change up how your deck can function. And that sometimes might be a negative thing, but that sometimes might be a positive thing.
Yeah. Um, it's funny that we keep mentioning security control because I will go on the record and say that I think sideboards will hopefully curb security drill. Because again, in my opinion, the point of a side deck is to help your most extreme matchups, not your most like middling matchups. Like I don't believe like a standard like mainline evolution deck versus mainline evolution deck has really a whole lot of a need for a sideboard. I'll really say that. Like I don't see it. It's because of decks like Rookie Rush and Security Control the sideboards need to exist because you have ways to because you have to hit both ends. You need cards that in your deck that stop Rookie Rush because otherwise you get run over by Rookie Rush, and you need cards that stop Security Control or help you in Security Control type matchups. And the problem is that usually, though not exclusively, these cards are just absolute dead weight in the reverse matchup.
Right. It's like running a Chumon against security control really isn't going to do much, but a Chumon against Rookie Rush can actually be worth its weight in gold sometimes.
I mean, I would go as far as like the easiest example for me is removal, and it's where I kind of started with my blacklist. So I I was mainlining one copy of each. I kind of changed my design philosophy a little bit for my decks after like looking at nationals lists, and I like the nationals lists are a perfect example of mainlining side deckable cards. Tons of one ofs, tons of really niche tech cards main boarded because they had to. They had no option. They had no idea what they were going to play against. It was a long tournament. They played, you know, game after game after game with the ability to change nothing. And a sideboard like helps that, prevents. So now you can make these like different permutations of your deck all rounding around your sideboard.
Right, and like you said, you want to cater to your worst matchups. So, like, just as an example, like, I hate going back to security control, but like, it's just a good example to just show like how sometimes those small tech cards can matter. Where it's just like I've played against with my Gabuband deck, I played against security control with Troy and without Troy, and I can tell you for a fact Ancient Troyamon as a sideboard tech, if you were teching it in for specifically the Gabuban matchup, is the strongest thing you could possibly do because otherwise, it doesn't matter how much you recover, I can still hit your security like 15 times over.
Hmm.
Like,
And honestly, like outside like a specific example, I mean I know someone with more experience could definitely like school me on the subject a little bit, but like um people keep bringing up the security control and Gabu Bond, but Gabu Bond is like the spiritual successor to Rookie Rush. Um, and the idea being that like the most aggressive and the most control-y decks, the extreme ends of the spectrum, are the ones that cause the most frustrations. Obviously, it's because the matchups that are so much one-sided. And um, so for a Gabuban player to allow them to have a sideboard, I feel like means less. This is like I said, like I know someone could probably sit down and come up with a fantastic Gabuban sideboard that checks all the boxes, but their deck list is already so restrictive and their game plan is already so finite. You know, there aren't you can't tech in more Gabubans, you can't tech in more Matt Tamers. Like your package is very small, and I guess as a result you could fit more around it, but like then it hurts your Gabu. Like you still have to win kind of quick with Gabuband. And security control, um, while they can tech some things against Gabuband, that just I feel like just plays to the point that those are the two things people are going to tech against, you know. And I feel like it lessens it middles the game, I guess. Like I said, like no one's teching against you know, black blockers. Unless your security control, because I specifically made my deck to beat yours, and I don't like anyone that plays it. But, like, congratulations, you've added a blue package to your security control matchup, and now I don't win every match. But that's the benefit of a sideboard. Turning those, oh boy, my opponent flipped the scissors to my paper. It reduces those odds.
right. And like that's kind of the reason why we actually haven't really had a tier 0 deck is because there's just a whole bunch of like viable decks that kind of all check each other where it's just like, okay, Gabu Bond checks security control checks, let's just use Jesmon just because we like picking on him, and then Jesmon checks Gabubond, or
Mhm.
reverse that actually.
Yeah.
Um, and like that's just the rock paper scissors nature of it. And if more decks are allowed to exist because of sideboarding, that just means we have more decks to play and there's more diversity. Um, and like that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like the strong decks are still going to stand out on top. It's just now other decks are actually allowed to exist because they can actually play to their strengths and then side in what they need to fix up their weaknesses.
So, um, everything I've said has been, like under the current context and the current situations. So I will say something that Bandai now needs to look forward and watch out. Understanding like I do know that they designed for Japan. I do know that I feel like while on brand as Magna Kidmon is and on theme, like those kinds of cards cannot exist like wholesale because the idea that you could have a deck that so Avenge I don't know if I called it Avenge Kidmon the first time, but it's Avenge Kidmon. Um, with a sideboard, it's functionally the end of Three Musketeers. Like it already was a deck that like didn't get a whole lot, but that it actually just if you could just sideboard in 2 or 3 Avenge Kidmon and just win the game, like that's the kind of thing that sideboards would be a bad environment to introduce.
Yeah, and then like it would then fall like the counter argument would be it would then fall up to Three Musketeers to figure out how to counter it. So like the counter to Avenge Kidmon for Three Musketeers is that they wouldn't
Just
necessarily
stop
go
running Three
wholehearted.
Musketeers in their
Uh,
Three Musketeers decks.
yes, they would basically just rely solely on Bellastarmon and run some slightly fewer options, and then figure out ways to kind of shore up the avenge answer, where it's just like, okay, I know the opponent's going to avenge me. That's going to be awful. How could I reduce those chances? So they might play a little bit more into Beelzemon as just an example, where it's just like you're already playing Itmons, so there's no reason why you couldn't just play Beelzemon and then just run some level sevens and call it a day. So like there are ways to counteract that, but yeah, uh, a direct, like a more direct hate card is not necessarily something super beneficial for sideboards. Like silver bullets, like the memory blockers and the cost reducers, non-summoners, whatever you want to label these cards as, where it's like they're a rookie that has a shutdown ability. Um,
Rookies are fairly
those are
easy
fine.
removal though. I
Yeah,
honestly
that's
don't have
that's
a
the whole
problem
point.
with them that much. Like
And that's the whole point why they're on rookies. It's
yeah,
just like you tell a Mega that it can't do that, you're gonna have to Gaia Force that. And if you're Gaia Forcing that, like that's gonna feel really, really bad.
that's why it was actually brought up um as someone from my locals because we were talking about it. Because I hadn't considered it because I main decked it the whole time and it was like the basically the but like Craniumon. Like you could just sideboard Craniumons and just slam that shit down against security control and tell them to pan sand. In non like though like Craniumon is almost like just like kind of Mechanorimon or Revenge Kidmon. It doesn't matter what deck you're playing. It doesn't matter what your game plan is. They give you a bunch of memory. You slam a Craniumon and they cry.
Yeah,
Like that those are the kinds of cards that would need to exist less because I hadn't really thought of that. Like, you could be a Gabubond that side decks in 2 copies of Craniumon or 3 copies. See, that's the point though. This is the fun the game with sideboarding is. Do you really want to side in 4 copies of Craniumon in security control matchups? Probably not. You'd probably be better off just siding in the entire Pepsi package of red, the Azorius package, or not Azorius, is it? But like just making your deck 2 colors for the purposes of beating security control rather than slamming 4 Craniumon in there that do nothing other than our Craniumon.
right. And like people were harping on like um a delicate plan just because it's like every deck can now splash in like 2 copies of starter deck tie and 2 copies of a delicate plan and call it a day. And it's just like, yeah, but that's kind of the point. Like if something is not necessarily like that toxic, even though I do think security control is extremely toxic, discussion for another time. um like it gives decks the actual flexibility to try to solve that problem, and that's kind of like literally all a game is specifically a card game, is solving the opponent's problem. The opponent is presenting you with a problem. How are you going to respond? And like sideboarding just makes that decision making a little bit more deeper. And yes, they do need to kind of watch their hate cards and silver bullets a little bit more. But like they've kind of already been subtly doing some of that, especially more with security control and rookie rush, where it's just like, okay, Takumi was created because in I think it was BT
3?
three.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rookie Rush was
Two
hitting
sets ahead.
peak
It's always two
popularity.
sets ahead.
Yeah, Rookie Rush was hitting peak popularity, and then come BT5, we saw security control start to take a huge rise because of Zwart defeat, and then Analog Youth was created to try to counter that. So like they already are subtly trying to create these counters, and now you actually have an outlet to have those counters exist a little bit more cleanly rather than just forcing it into your main deck, taking up precious deck space that could be for something to actually help promote your game plan.
Yeah. Um, and I've tried to mention this like 3 or 4 times, but because I keep thinking about how crazy it was and how fantastic it was, but um, like really, like like my like perfect example of why I think side decking is a fantastic addition. And I lost. I guess I'll start with this. I lost it. I lost the game because of it. But I honestly, I didn't even feel bad. I was like, wow, I got outplayed. I was out side decked, and not a meme, not a joke. I played against a Lilith Loop. I was playing Machine Dramon, mostly because it's the only deck that was completely untouched, as I've already taken apart all my other decks for BT7 shells. But and we were trialing, I guess, like it's just a thing at my locals now. I'm playing Machine Dramon versus Slowthloop, and in game, so he wins game one. We go to game two. I sideboard in my quote unquote like anti Lilith Loop package. I side in some memory blockers. I side in some emergency program halts. I don't change the deck too much. It already kind of does what it wants to do and doesn't really have room for anything else. But I wanted to side because it was the first time I was actually really side decking, and my opponent managed to, because of the flexibility of purple and the flexibility of deck lists, he basically swapped from Lilith Loop to Titamon OTK in 10 cards and OTK'd me. I wasn't
Yeah,
even
and
mad. I was like, what is this shit? He took all of his Lilithmon out knowing I was going to put in a bunch of Lilithmon hate.
like I think that's like a good thing and a bad thing. Like it means now you have to prepare for more deck possibilities. But at the same time it opens up a lot more creativity and flexibility in terms of like what we could do and how we could play. So to kind of like wrap things up a little bit, just because it is getting a little bit on the later side,
Hmm.
um, these rule changes are not finite. They are not concrete yet. This is just a test. We don't need to over exaggerate things saying this is the new future of Digimon when it literally says this is a test specifically for this event. We don't know if other events are going to continue testing. We don't know if these rules are going to change or not. Like there's still a lot of unknowns that we just not can't like lock them down to. So like that's just the big important thing. But I do think it is not necessarily going to be the worst thing in the world. It's not going to kill decks. It's not going to kill the game. It's going to, like, if anything, it's going to open up creativity and flexibility and make the game a little bit more easier for these best of three matches.
Yeah, we already play a more competitive game than Japan does, so for us to already introduce additional levels of competitiveness, additional levels of skill, and while there are going to be people, myself included 100%, where I will lose matches now that I wouldn't have lost without side decks or without mulligans or without both, um, the better player will win more frequently, and from my mind set as a competitive Digimon player, that's the ultimate goal. It's just the better player to win more frequently and less dependent upon exactly which deck they bring and which decks they play against and what their starting hand is.
Right, because like sometimes you get into these tournaments and that's all your takeaway really is I just got unlucky. I faced the wrong opponents. I just prepped for the wrong type of meta. And like we've all kind of been there where it's just like good players lose. I'm not saying good players should win all the time, nor should they lose all the time. I'm just saying
Mhm.
like good players sometimes just make the wrong meta call and then are just completely out like tournamented by the
Mhm.
tournament.
Yeah. Like just like the idea of like I know there was a specific example from the North American Nationals where like a player managed to reach day two without playing against a single Gabu Bond, whereas most players that made day two only played against Gabu Bond. Like as an example of like sometimes you just if I would have been like upset if I was someone who had brought a deck specifically designed to beat Gabumon that I thought had a positive matchup with Gabumon because it usually meant I had a worse matchup in other situations like security control or something like that.
Right, and these types of rule changes help eliminate some of that feeling where it's just like, now I have to really look upon myself, what did I do wrong, rather than I just brought the wrong deck, or I just played against the wrong opponents. Like, factors outside of your control are now slowly being put into your control, and I'm not saying you should just be mad at yourself for losing, but like, it puts things into a new perspective that players might not be used to.
Hmm. And like just the idea that um you don't lose just because your opponent like I feel like the ability it lets like the people really like the meta has already been like power of the people, but it'll really factor in if not only do we play decks that beat security control, but we also dedicate a large amount of our sideboards to security control. I mean, we could really stomp them out of the meta, genuinely. Like or Rookie Rush, whichever becomes like the big bad, the new scary deck, and that'll be something that non-tier 1 decks or not, top 3 decks can use against those cuz no one's teching against, you know, green
Diaboromon
Aeospawn,
or
Diabon.
Diaboromon.
Yeah, like those decks, I guess well, green Diaboromon is that or black Diaboromon is at least an okay deck or good deck, but like nobody's teching against Aesmon, right? Like when I'm playing, if I ever play Psychomon from BT8 that we can't reduce play costs, like it's not for Aesmon, but like the idea being that like um these these sideboards will be built with top three in mind, which will make the top three less of an insurmountable climb, where they are just the three pillars above the rest or the four pillar, however many decks there are given the format.
Right.
So um yeah, I know we're like, cause I was just gonna go through like some stuff that people had mentioned about like anti-sideboard. Cause I don't like arguing with like I guess a straw man or like bringing up points that disagree with me just for me to refute the points that I made up on the spot. But as someone like I said, I have a lot of competitive history with Magic, and in a game where your resources are your cards, the Mulligans helped literally prevent games where you couldn't play the game. But um, even in Digimon, a lot of those hands were like that, and the Mulligan really lets you just start out from a more even playing field. Let your actually get to play your deck versus your opponent's decks. You know,
Sometimes you'll mulligan to an even worse hand, but again, that's just the risk of
and it's a
mulliganing.
skill. Yeah, it's a skill thing, right? Like, I mean, I guess it's a skill thing with a small amount of luck thing, like every other card game is. But
Yeah. I think time-wise, we don't necessarily have enough time to introduce all of those counterpoints,
no,
at least not in this
I was
episode.
I was
It's
gonna
just
try and bring some up, but like we kind of hit them all, like without me naming them specifically.
right, like it's just a very deep topic that takes more than just one or two people to really talk about. Like I've seen a whole bunch of other people already be talking about it, and like I kind of roll my eyes because they're like trying to clickbait the crap out of people, and I just like trying to take a more honest approach. Like really take a step back, uh put my personal feelings aside and like look at things more objectively rather than just be like, how can I hype this up just for the views? Like,
Eh,
that's not me, and that's not my goal. That's not what I'm trying to do.
yeah. I also feel like there's merit in you don't have to necessarily acknowledge the other side. You can just do you. Like,
Right.
but um Yeah, that's why I was trying to be as forthcoming as what I could with with my math that I have, or like if I ever like cite statistics in some way, I'll provide the data set just because I don't like pulling numbers out of my ass.
Right.
So
As one should. Like the proof is in the pudding, and you're bringing the pudding to the party.
yeah. Um, I guess concluding thoughts. I think 10 cards is really like the number. I don't expect it to get any bigger. I don't expect it to get any smaller. It's like a perfect amount. Just enough so that I have to buy more sleeves for all my decks. Um, and
Well,
I think
most card packs come with 60 anyway, or like
I buy
yeah,
hundreds.
yeah, or most people just buy 100 and split it in half.
Well, that's the thing.
Uh,
Well, a hundred used to make two decks. Now a hundred makes two decks minus sideboards. So now I need more than one pack for two decks. I need
I guess that's
120 now.
yeah, but Bandai was like, just buy our sleeves instead, and then you're good to go. So
Yeah. Um, and then the mulligan, like super fair, super easy inclusion. Like as far as like what I imagined a Digimon mulligan to be, I think it's fairly clean. Like I don't expect it to change. I don't expect, and honestly, I guess my concluding thoughts being that like I hope everyone tries it. Even if you can't attend DigiFest, I hope like maybe you could do something not necessarily like my locals where I'm pretty sure regardless of whether it's fully implemented, all of my like small for fun level locals will exclusively have side decks and mulligans like forever now. But like just really play with it, experience it, and then provide feedback, Really like talk to people and, you know, nail down why you don't like it if you don't like it, or why you do like it if you do.
right, and don't forget to like just positively express this. Like you don't always have to be super negative and critical about everything. Like the point is, as of right now with DigiFest, it is just an experiment. It's to see what people feel, what's people like, what they enjoy, and then they can make those adjustments and changes according to all of that feedback. So neutrally staying neutral, or like taking a more positive tone where it's just like, I appreciate your attempt at this, but like be
Hmm.
more constructive if you're adding actual criticism.
Yeah, and honestly, like I hope Bandai at least is also fair and like open with us about like the numbers that come out of it. Like if like Jesmon just being the easiest example, if we come out of DigiFest and all of a sudden Jesmon's like 50% of the top, after but even then that's saying like just we know Jesmon's getting hit in BT8 anyway, so like if Jesmon was like oppressive for one set with because of the side decking in the mulligans, would it really be the end of the world? But I digress.
Right. Like this is something that we are going to take some time getting used to if it is actually going to be implemented, and what that implementation is going to look like might differ from what we've been currently testing just because it's just a test.
Yep. So yeah, I guess especially those that are definitely like heart set against it, that I like whatever version of Mulligan you have in your mind or whatever version of side deck in your mind, like just like talk to people at like what is your side deck? Why are you running that? Oh, that's cool. I'm running this. Like it opens more discussion, like and it honestly what I also have done is I've cut back on my tech options in my main decks. My game one is a lot more vanilla now, which I think is better because it's more practicable. You know, there are less dead cards that are I guess exactly that dead cards in my main deck in my top 50 because it's like oh boy that's a Cutemon. I really wish it were not a Cutemon right now.
Right.
So, do you have anything else? I think that's all I have to say. Said my piece.
That's kind of, I think we kind of hit all of like the major points that we wanted to. Um, it's just something different, something fun, and if this does get implemented and change our format, like good, that's fine. We should be different from Japan. Like, granted, yes, the cards are going to be designed for Japan, and then the way the English is going to be implementing them is going to be completely different. But like it makes it so that we don't have to always just look at Japan's data and just be like, okay, Justmon's best deck just because Justmon won the most in Japan. Like, That's not how we should be thinking about building decks and looking at card games as a whole. Like, we should be the ones to figure out ourselves and experiment ourselves what we want out of the game. And if this is a good push in that direction, then I'm in favor for it. But if it turns out to be something more negative, then we should address that when it comes up.
Yeah. Um, I guess yeah, definitely like give us feedback too. Like what do you guys want to hear about the discussion involving side decks or um mulligans or just like big kind of top-down topics like this? Because I think these kinds of discussions are more in line with what we had like the idea behind like us even recording this at all because we've had these kinds of conversations, in Discord calls before where we just kind of rant about things for an hour to each other. At least now we do it for the purposes of others.
Right, because I really do enjoy all of your feedback, and I do appreciate anyone who actually like gets all the way to the end and is enjoying this type of content because like it really does. I mean, obviously we're doing it for fun for our sake, but we also want to like have a more in-depth conversation with you, the viewers, or you, the players, because you also might have some insight that we are currently missing.
Hmm. Yeah, and especially if like um you're someone who has like something to say about mulligans or side decks that like we could maybe attack in like another episode or like in the future like after digifest if we speak it. I can't guarantee that we're going to do another one, but if we do, like give us something to talk about, I guess.
Right.
So that's really all I have
But
to say.
yep, that's all I got too. So let's just close it out.
Okay. So yeah, this has been the Wolf Den podcast.
I hope everyone has a wonderful day or night whenever you're listening to this.
Goodbye.